I pulled into the gravel parking area at Olympic National Park and killed the engine, already running through my mental checklist. 6 backpacks needed to come out of my truck, along with the group gear I'd packed the night before. The morning air carried that familiar Pacific Northwest bite, cool enough to make you want to keep moving, but not cold enough to worry about yet. My clients were supposed to meet me here at 8, and it was 5 minutes past. Right on schedule, a blue Honda pulled up next to my truck, followed by a white SUV. I climbed out and started unloading gear while they parked and gathered themselves. The first guy out of the Honda looked like he knew what he was doing, mid-40s maybe, with the kind of build that comes from actual hiking rather than gym workouts. His boots were broken in, his clothes practical without being flashy. He walked over with the easy confidence of someone who'd done this before. "You must be Michael," he said, extending a hand. "Andy Peterson." "That's me." His grip was firm, but not trying to prove anything. "Good to meet you. You look ready for this." "Been looking forward to it for months." Andy glanced around at the trailhead, the dense forest stretching away from the parking area. "How long you been guiding out here?" "About 10 years now." I hefted Sarah's pack out of the truck bed. She'd sent me her gear list weeks ago, and everything looked properly organized. "You hike much in the Olympics before?" "Some day trips, but never a full week in the backcountry. This is exactly what I needed." I liked him already. Too many clients came in thinking they knew everything, or worse, knowing nothing and trying to hide it. Andy seemed like the kind of guy who'd actually be helpful, rather than just another person to keep track of. The others were making their way over from the SUV. Sarah Collins looked nervous but excited, adjusting her pack straps about 3 times before she'd even put it on. David Miller was already complaining about something to the 2 women with him, Jessica Rodriguez and Rebecca Hall. I couldn't make out the words, but his tone suggested he'd found something to be unhappy about. "All right, everyone," I called out, shouldering my own pack. "Let's do a quick gear check before we head out." The next 20 minutes involved going through everyone's equipment, making sure they had what they needed and nothing they didn't. Andy's setup was solid. He'd clearly done his research. Sarah had overpacked a bit, but nothing we couldn't work with. David kept questioning whether his pack was too heavy, though he'd ignored my suggestions to leave behind the extra camera equipment he'd insisted on bringing. Jessica and Rebecca seemed well prepared and eager to get started. "The plan for today is about 12 miles, I told them as we gathered at the trailhead sign. "We'll be heading through old-growth forest most of the way, gaining elevation gradually. Tonight's camp is at a designated backcountry site with bear boxes and a decent water source." Sarah raised her hand like we were in school. "What should we do if we see a bear?" "Make noise, don't run, give it space." I'd given this talk hundreds of times, but honestly, you're more likely to see deer or maybe some elk. The bears up here mostly want to be left alone. David shifted his pack again. "How do we know we won't get lost?" "That's what I'm here for." I tapped the GPS unit clipped to my belt, then the map case. Plus, I've been on this trail more times than I can count. My grandfather used to bring me up here when I was a kid. That last part slipped out without me meaning to say it. I usually kept personal details to myself with clients, but something about this group made me more talkative than usual. Maybe it was Andy's easy manner, or maybe I was just in a good mood. We started up the trail in single file, me leading, Andy bringing up the rear. The first few miles were easy enough. Well-maintained trail through Douglas fir and cedar that towered overhead like cathedral pillars. The forest floor was thick with ferns and fallen logs slowly returning to soil. Jessica was already taking pictures, which meant we'd be stopping frequently. Rebecca seemed content to walk and observe. Sarah asked questions about every plant she didn't recognize, which turned out to be most of them. David saved his energy for periodic comments about the weight of his pack. "Your grandfather taught you to guide?" Andy asked during one of our photo stops. "Among other things." I adjusted the straps on Sarah's pack. She was carrying the weight too high. He was a logger for 40 years, then did some guiding when he retired. Knew these woods better than anyone. Robert Thompson had been the kind of man who could read weather patterns 3 days out, who could find water in the driest conditions, who never seemed to get lost no matter how deep into the wilderness we went. After my parents died in that car accident when I was 8, he'd been the one to step in, to teach me everything he knew about surviving in places where most people had no business being. He'd also told me stories that made no sense, tales about things in the deep woods that weren't quite animal and weren't quite human. The flayed man was his favorite, some kind of creature that had supposedly been stalking these forests for generations. According to Robert, it looked like a person who'd had all their skin stripped away, leaving nothing but raw muscle and sinew. Complete nonsense, of course, but he'd tell these stories with such conviction that I'd sometimes have trouble sleeping afterward. Must have been quite a teacher, Andy said. He was. I shouldered my pack again. All right, let's keep moving. We've got a lot of ground to cover. The trail wound deeper into the forest, following an old creek bed that ran clear and cold over granite stones. The canopy grew thicker as we gained elevation, filtering the afternoon light into shifting patterns on the forest floor. My client settled into a rhythm, Jessica still stopping for photos, but less frequently, Sarah finding her stride and asking fewer questions, David's complaints tapering off as he got used to the pack weight. This was the part of guiding I actually enjoyed, watching a group of strangers begin to work together, seeing them discover they were capable of more than they'd thought. Andy moved like he belonged out here, helping Sarah when she struggled over a fallen log, offering encouragement to Rebecca when the trail got steep. By late afternoon, we'd covered the planned distance. The designated campsite sat in a small clearing beside the creek, with 3 bear boxes and a fire ring that had seen plenty of use. The trees around the perimeter were massive old growth, the kind that had been standing here since before the first European settlers arrived. "This is home for tonight," I announced, dropping my pack near the fire ring. Everyone looked tired but satisfied. Even David seemed pleased with himself for making the distance without too much trouble. Jessica immediately started setting up her camera for what she called golden hour shots, while Rebecca and Sarah claimed spots for their tents. "What can I do to help?" Andy asked, already pulling gear from his pack with practiced efficiency. "You can help me get the bear ropes set up while they get their tents sorted." I appreciated clients who looked for ways to contribute rather than waiting to be told what to do. "Then we'll get dinner going." The next hour was exactly what I hoped for on the first night of any trip. Tents went up without drama, gear got organized, people started to relax. Andy proved to be exactly the kind of hiking partner you wanted, competent, helpful, and easy to talk with. He handled the camp setup like he'd been doing it for years. "How's everyone feeling?" I asked as we got the stove fired up for dinner. "Better than I expected," Sarah admitted. "My legs are tired, but it's a good tired." "I could do this every day," Jessica said, scrolling through the photos on her camera. "Look at these trees." David had found a log to sit on and was working off his boots. Not bad for day one, though I'm definitely feeling that pack weight. "You'll get used to it," Rebecca told him. "My shoulders were killing me the first few miles, but now it feels normal." We cooked a simple dinner of pasta and vegetables, everyone contributing to the conversation as the forest settled into evening quiet around us. No traffic noise, no city sounds, just the creek running over stones and the occasional bird call from somewhere up in the canopy. The weather couldn't have been better. Clear skies, mild temperature, no sign of the rain that could make hiking in the Olympics miserable. Andy and I worked together cleaning up after dinner while the others wrote in journals or organized their gear for the next day. "This is exactly what I needed," Andy said, rinsing our cooking pot in the creek. "Been too long since I've been somewhere you can actually see the stars." I looked up through the gap in the trees. The first stars were beginning to show, and with full darkness still an hour away, we'd have an impressive display later. "Wait until midnight. You'll see more stars than you knew existed." "Your grandfather bring you to spots like this?" "All over these mountains." I dried the pot and packed it away. He knew every trail, every water source, every good camping spot within 50 miles. Said his father taught him, and his father before that. Family tradition then. Something like that. I didn't mention the other stories Robert used to tell, the warnings about staying on established trails, about never camping alone in certain areas, about things that supposedly roamed the deep woods after dark. Old superstitions from a time when people didn't understand the wilderness the way we do now. He taught me to respect the forest, but not to fear it. We finished cleaning up as darkness settled over the campsite. Everyone was in good spirits, tired enough to sleep well, but not exhausted. Jessica had gotten her star photos. Sarah was writing enthusiastically in her journal. Rebecca and David were comparing notes about tomorrow's route. I set up my tent last, as always, positioning myself where I could keep an eye on the whole camp. Force of habit from years of guiding, you sleep better when you know everyone else is safe and accounted for. "Good first day," Andy said, settling into his sleeping bag. His tent was set up next to mine, close enough to talk without raising our voices. Couldn't ask for better. I zipped up my tent and arranged my gear for the morning. Weather's supposed to hold for the next few days. If it does, we're in for a hell of a week. The forest around us had gone quiet except for the creek and the occasional rustle of something small moving through the underbrush. Normal sounds, familiar sounds. The kind of wilderness lullaby that had been putting me to sleep since I was 8 years old and learning to love these mountains. Everyone settled in quickly, the exhaustion of the first day catching up. I could hear quiet conversations from a couple of the tents, but they faded as people drifted off. Andy was already breathing deeply in the rhythm of sleep. I lay there listening to the forest, mentally planning tomorrow's route, thinking about how well the group had come together on day one. These were good people, the kind who made guiding a pleasure rather than a job. Andy especially. Having someone that competent and easygoing made everything smoother. The last thing I remembered before sleep was the sound of the creek running over stones, the same sound that had been putting travelers to sleep in these mountains for generations. I woke to Andy rustling around in his tent, the soft sounds of someone who knew how to break camp quietly. The creek still murmured beside us, and gray pre-dawn light filtered through the forest canopy. My internal clock said it was around 6:30, which meant we'd gotten a solid night's sleep. "Morning," Andy whispered as I unzipped my tent. He was already dressed and rolling up his sleeping bag with practiced efficiency. "Sleep well?" "Like a rock. You?" "Same." I stretched my back and looked around the campsite. Everyone else was still in their tents, but I could hear stirring from Sarah's direction. Let's get coffee started before we wake the others. The second day began exactly as it should. Everyone rested, gear dry, spirits high. Sarah emerged from her tent looking more confident than she had yesterday, while David seemed to have made peace with his pack weight overnight. Jessica immediately started documenting our morning routine with her camera, and Rebecca helped Andy organize the bear boxes. We broke camp efficiently and hit the trail by 8:30, leaving the creek behind as we began climbing toward higher elevation. The switchback started almost immediately, cutting back and forth up the mountainside through dense forest that gradually thinned as we gained altitude. This is where it gets interesting. I told the group during our first rest stop. "We've got about 3,000 feet of elevation gain over the next 6 miles. Sarah was already breathing harder, her cheeks flushed from the climb. "How high are we going?" "Today's camp is around 4,500 feet. Tomorrow we'll push up to nearly 6,000. I checked my GPS and consulted the map. The good news is that once we get up there, the views make all this climbing worth it." Andy moved easily on the steep terrain, sometimes hiking backward while talking to Sarah, offering encouragement when she needed to stop and catch her breath. His natural leadership took pressure off me to constantly monitor the group's pace. "Altitude hitting you?" he asked Sarah during one break. "A little. I live at sea level, so this is new." She took another drink from her water bottle. "But I'm not giving up." "Good attitude. Your body will adjust in another day or two." David was handling the climb better than I'd expected, though he still found things to complain about. "Whoever designed this trail clearly never carried a 40-pound pack," he muttered. But there was no real irritation in his voice. The forest changed as we climbed. Douglas fir and cedar gave way to mountain hemlock and subalpine fir, the trees growing smaller and more widely spaced. Patches of snow lingered in shadowed areas despite the mild weather, and the air carried a crisp bite that made you want to keep moving. By noon, we'd reached a rocky ridge with spectacular views across the Olympic Mountains. Snow-capped peaks stretched to the horizon, and far below us, the valley we'd climbed from that morning looked like a green carpet. "Now, this is why I came," Jessica said, setting up her camera for what would probably be 100 photos. We spread out along the ridge for lunch, everyone finding their own spot to eat and take in the scenery. Sarah seemed to have found her stride on the climb, and even David looked pleased with himself for making it this far. Rebecca had been quiet most of the morning, but she seemed content to observe and absorb the mountain environment. "Your grandfather ever bring you up here?" Andy asked, settling beside me on a flat boulder. "Every summer when I was a kid." I pointed toward a distant peak. "See that one with the glacier? We climbed it when I was 16. Took 3 days and I thought I was going to die on the way up. But you made it." "Robert wouldn't let me quit. Said the mountains don't care about your comfort, only your determination." I unwrapped my sandwich and looked out across the peaks. He was big on life lessons disguised as camping trips. The afternoon descent into our planned campsite was easier on everyone's legs, but harder on their knees. We dropped into a broad meadow surrounded by rocky outcroppings and scattered alpine fir. A small stream ran along one edge, providing perfect access to water. "This is where we'll spend tonight," I announced, dropping my pack near a level spot suitable for tents. The meadow was beautiful, maybe 100 yards across, carpeted with mountain grass and dotted with wildflowers. The rocky ridges around us provided shelter from wind, while offering multiple vantage points for views. Jessica was already circling the campsite with her camera, capturing the afternoon light on the surrounding peaks. "I could live here," Rebecca said, standing in the center of the meadow and turning slowly to take in the complete view. Andy had started pulling gear from his pack when he stopped mid-motion, his attention fixed on something beyond the camp. He stood slowly, his hand shading his eyes as he stared toward the eastern ridge. "Michael, you see that?" I followed his direction and immediately spotted what had caught his attention. On a rocky outcrop maybe half a mile away, a human figure stood perfectly still, apparently looking directly toward our campsite. "Yeah, I see him." I reached for my binoculars and focused on the distant ridge. The magnification confirmed what we'd both noticed, a man standing alone on the rocks, completely motionless. Too far away to make out details, but something about his posture felt wrong. Not the way someone normally stood when they stopped to rest or take in a view. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing across the meadow. "You okay over there?" No response, no movement. The figure remained exactly as we'd first seen him. Andy cupped his hands around his mouth. "Need any help?" Still nothing. The man continued to stand there like a statue, and even through the binoculars I couldn't detect any sign that he'd heard us or was even aware of our presence. "What's going on?" Jessica had noticed us staring and walked over with her camera. "There's someone on that ridge," Andy told her, pointing. "Been standing there since we arrived." Jessica raised her camera and zoomed in with the telephoto lens. "I can see him. He's just standing there." "Maybe he's taking pictures," Sarah suggested, though she sounded uncertain. "For 15 minutes without moving." David had joined our little observation group. "That's weird." I lowered the binoculars and studied the ridge with my naked eyes. The figure was clearly visible against the rocky background, a dark silhouette that hadn't shifted position since we'd first noticed him. "Should we go check on him?" Jessica asked. "He could be hurt or lost or something." The same thought had occurred to me, but something about the situation made me hesitate. Maybe it was the complete stillness or the way he seemed to be focused directly on us, but my instincts were telling me to be cautious. "Let's finish setting up camp first," I decided. "Keep an eye on him while we work. If he's still there in an hour, we'll figure out what to do." Andy nodded his agreement, but I could see the concern in his expression. We both understood wilderness emergencies. People got lost, injured, disoriented. The responsible thing would be to check on anyone who appeared to need help, but this didn't feel like someone who needed help. The group spread out to set up their tents, but everyone kept glancing toward the eastern ridge. The figure remained exactly where we'd first spotted him, standing with the same unnatural stillness that had initially caught Andy's attention. "Still there," Rebecca reported after 20 minutes. She'd positioned her tent to face the ridge and had been checking periodically while organizing her gear. I took another look through the binoculars. Same position, same posture. If the man was breathing, I couldn't detect any movement from this distance. He looked like he'd been carved from the rock itself. "This is getting creepy," David muttered, struggling with his tent stakes in the rocky ground. "Probably just a hiker taking a break," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. "Some people like to find a good view and just sit with it for a while." Sarah looked up from arranging her sleeping bag. "My dad does that. He'll find a spot he likes and just stand there for an hour, thinking about whatever dads think about." Jessica had been checking on the figure through her camera lens every few minutes. "I took some pictures. Maybe when I zoom in later I can see more details." Andy walked over to where I was testing the camp stove. "What do you think?" "I think it's probably nothing," I said quietly so the others wouldn't hear. "But I don't like it. The way he's positioned, it's like he's watching us. Could be coincidence. These ridges are natural stopping points for hikers. For an hour, without moving, I had to admit Andy was right. The behavior was unusual enough to be concerning, but not necessarily dangerous. People did strange things in the wilderness sometimes. Maybe the guy was having some kind of spiritual experience, or dealing with personal problems, or just enjoying the solitude in his own way. Let's keep an eye on him while we cook dinner, I decided. If he's still there when it gets dark, then we'll figure out what to do. The next hour passed slowly. Everyone went through the motions of setting up camp and preparing for the evening, but the conversation was more subdued than it had been the previous night. The presence of the mysterious figure cast a shadow over what should have been another perfect day in the mountains. Jessica checked on him regularly through her camera. "Still hasn't moved," she reported each time. David had given up pretending it wasn't bothering him. This is seriously weird. Who stands in one place for 2 hours? Maybe he's waiting for someone, Sarah suggested, like a meeting spot or something. Rebecca shook her head. Way too remote for that. We haven't seen another person since the trailhead. Andy helped me get the dinner started while keeping one eye on the ridge. The figure remained visible in the late afternoon light, a dark shape against the granite that never seemed to change position or posture. You ever see anything like this before? He asked while I boiled water for our freeze-dried meals. Not exactly. I stirred the pasta and tried to think of similar situations from my years of guiding. Had some strange encounters over the years, but nothing quite like this. Strange how? I almost mentioned some of Robert's stories, the tales about unusual things in the deep wilderness that had always seemed like folklore. But those were just old mountain legends, the kind of stories that got passed down and embellished over generations. Just people doing unexpected things. The mountains make some folks act different. As evening approached and the light began to fade, our mysterious observer remained exactly where we'd first seen him. The other ridge features were becoming harder to distinguish in the gathering dusk, but somehow the figure stayed clearly visible, as if the failing light didn't affect him the same way it affected everything else. Okay, this is officially creepy, David announced. Nobody stands that still for 3 hours. Andy was checking through the binoculars again. He's still there, same exact position. The atmosphere in our camp had shifted completely. What had started as mild curiosity was becoming genuine unease. Even Sarah, who'd been trying to find reasonable explanations, looked worried. Should we call out again? Jessica asked. I cupped my hands and shouted across the meadow, my voice echoing off the surrounding ridges. Hey, you all right over there? Nothing. No response, no acknowledgement, no movement. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. Not just the absence of a reply, but something deeper, like the whole mountain was holding its breath. Andy lowered the binoculars and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Michael, I don't think that's a normal hiker. I wanted to disagree, to offer some rational explanation that would make everyone feel better. But standing there in the gathering darkness, staring across the meadow at a figure who'd remained motionless for hours, I couldn't shake the feeling that Andy was right. Something about this situation was very wrong. Andy and I worked out a watch schedule without discussing it much with the others. No point in making everyone lose sleep over something that might turn out to be nothing, though neither of us really believed that anymore. I'll take first watch, Andy offered quietly while the group finished dinner preparations. Wake me up in 3 hours. I nodded and helped clean up the cooking gear, trying to act normal while keeping one eye on the eastern ridge. The figure was still there, somehow easier to see now that full darkness had settled over the meadow. He stood out against the starlit sky like a dark cutout, motionless as ever. Jessica crawled into her tent first, followed by Rebecca and Sarah. David lingered by the dying fire, poking at the coals with a stick. You think that guy's still up there? He asked. Probably moved on by now, I lied. Through my peripheral vision, I could see the silhouette clearly outlined against the stars. David nodded and headed to his tent. Well, if he wants to stand around all night, that's his business. Andy settled against a boulder with the binoculars while I arranged my sleeping bag outside my tent. The night air was crisp but not cold, and the stars were brilliant in the thin mountain atmosphere. Under normal circumstances, it would have been perfect camping weather, but nothing about this felt normal. I dozed fitfully for the first part of the night, waking every hour or so to check on Andy. Each time he'd give me a subtle thumbs up, indicating our watcher was still in position. The forest around us stayed quiet except for the usual small sounds: mice rustling in the grass, the distant call of an owl, wind moving through the scattered trees. Around midnight, Andy shook my shoulder gently. "Your turn," he whispered. I took the binoculars and settled into his spot against the boulder. The figure remained exactly where we'd last seen him, a black shape against the star field that seemed too distinct for the available light. How was he still visible up there? At this distance and in this darkness, he should have disappeared into the background. Andy's breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep within minutes. The guy had the ability to fall asleep anywhere, anytime. A useful skill in the wilderness. The next few hours passed slowly. I checked the ridge every few minutes, and each time the figure was there, unchanged. My eyes started playing tricks on me in the darkness, making me think I saw movement where there wasn't any. Every shadow became suspicious, every sound significant. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something that made me sit up straighter. A clicking sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere in the forest behind our camp. Not the kind of noise any animal I knew would make. Too regular, too purposeful. I listened for several minutes, trying to pinpoint the source. The clicking stopped, then started again from a different direction. East of camp this time, closer to where our mysterious observer was positioned. The sound faded, replaced by what might have been scraping, like something being dragged across rock. I grabbed my flashlight and moved quietly away from the sleeping area, following the noise. 50 yards from camp, I stopped and listened again. Silence. I swept the flashlight beam across the trees and rocks, looking for any sign of what might have made the sounds. Nothing. Just forest and shadows, and the occasional glint of eyes from some small creature before it scurried away. I returned to my watch position, checking the ridge again through the binoculars. The figure was still there, same position, same unnatural stillness. An hour later, the clicking started again. This time it seemed to come from multiple directions, a scattered conversation of sharp sounds that lasted maybe 10 minutes before stopping completely. I made another careful circuit around the camp perimeter, but found nothing unusual. Andy stirred in his sleeping bag. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I whispered back. "Just some weird sounds. Probably nothing." But it wasn't nothing, and we both knew it. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I dozed fitfully until dawn started lightening the eastern sky. The first thing I did was check the ridge where our observer had been stationed. Empty. The rocky outcrop that had been occupied for hours showed no sign of anyone ever being there. "He's gone," I told Andy as he emerged from his sleeping bag. Andy took the binoculars and confirmed what I'd already seen. "When do you think he left?" "No idea. Sometime after 3, I guess." I started rolling up my sleeping bag, eager to get moving. "Let's get everyone up and pack out of here." The others woke slowly, stretching and complaining about the cold ground and restless sleep. Sarah looked particularly tired, with dark circles under her eyes. "Did anyone else hear weird noises last night?" she asked while stuffing her sleeping bag into its compression sack. Jessica looked up from organizing her camera equipment. "What kind of noises?" "I don't know. Clicking sounds, maybe?" I kept waking up thinking something was moving around outside. I exchanged a quick look with Andy. "Probably just wildlife. These mountains are full of animals you don't see during the day." "It didn't sound like animals," Sarah said, but she didn't push the point. I hurried everyone through breakfast and camp breakdown, claiming we needed to make good time to reach our next planned site. Really, I just wanted to get away from this meadow and whatever had been watching us through the night. We hit the trail by 8, earlier than usual. The route led us up through scattered alpine fir and across several rocky ridges before dropping into another valley system. Good hiking terrain, with spectacular views when the trees opened up enough to see the surrounding peaks. For the first few hours, I managed to convince myself that our mysterious observer had been exactly what I'd told the others, just another hiker who happened to stop in an inconvenient spot. People did strange things in the wilderness sometimes. Maybe he'd been having some kind of personal crisis or spiritual experience, or was simply eccentric in ways that seemed sinister from a distance. But around noon, while we rested on a granite outcrop overlooking the valley we'd just climbed out of, Andy tapped my shoulder and pointed back the way we'd come. There, on a distant ridge maybe a mile behind us, stood a lone figure. I raised my binoculars and focused on the spot. Same size, same posture, same unnatural stillness. Even at this distance, I could tell it was the same person who'd watched us through the night. "Son of a bitch," I muttered. "What is it?" Jessica asked, noticing our attention. "Just checking our route," Andy said smoothly, "making sure we're on track." I kept the binoculars trained on the distant figure while the others finished their lunch. He was definitely following us, maintaining enough distance to avoid direct confrontation, but staying close enough to keep us in sight. The realization made my stomach clench. "We need to keep moving," I announced, perhaps more sharply than necessary. The afternoon hike took us deeper into the wilderness, following game trails and old logging roads that most casual hikers never saw. This was the kind of terrain my grandfather had loved, remote enough that you could go days without seeing another person, beautiful enough to make you understand why some people never wanted to leave the mountains. Every hour or so, when the terrain allowed a clear view behind us, I'd check for our follower. He was always there, matching our pace, staying roughly the same distance away. Andy noticed too, though we didn't discuss it where the others could hear. The group was holding up well despite the longer-than-planned day. Sarah seemed to have found her hiking legs. David had stopped complaining about his pack weight, and Jessica and Rebecca were enjoying the increasingly remote and spectacular scenery. But I couldn't shake the growing dread that had been building since we'd first spotted our observer. This wasn't normal hiker behavior. People didn't follow strangers through the wilderness for hours, maintaining perfect distance while never making contact or revealing their intentions. We reached our planned campsite in late afternoon. Another meadow, this one smaller and more enclosed by rocky ridges. A spring provided good water, and the grass was level enough for comfortable tent placement. Under normal circumstances, it would have been an ideal spot. While everyone set up their gear, I found excuses to check our back trail repeatedly. Andy helped with camp chores while keeping an eye on me, reading my growing tension. "Anything?" he asked quietly while we filtered water at the spring. "Not yet, but he's back there somewhere." The evening routine proceeded normally. Dinner preparation, gear organization, the usual end-of-day conversations about tired feet and spectacular views. I tried to project calm confidence while my mind raced through contingency plans and escape routes. Then, just as we finished cooking, Rebecca looked up from her journal and pointed toward the northern ridge. "There's someone up there." My blood turned to ice. The figure stood on a rocky outcrop, maybe 200 yards from our camp, much closer than he'd ever been before. Close enough that even without binoculars, we could all see him clearly. I grabbed my binoculars with hands that tried not to shake and focused on the ridge. What I saw made my stomach drop through the ground. The figure was naked, or nearly so. His skin looked wrong, too red, too raw, like he'd been badly sunburned or worse. And he was making sounds, rhythmic clicking noises that carried clearly across the distance despite the space between us. The clicking was deliberate, purposeful, almost like communication, like he was trying to tell us something, or calling to something else. "What the hell?" David said, squinting toward the ridge. I lowered the binoculars, my mind flooding with memories I'd spent years trying to forget. Robert's voice echoing in my memory, telling stories around campfires when I was too young to understand that some warnings aren't meant as entertainment. The flayed man walks the deep woods, looking for others to join him. He was human once, but something happened to his skin, and now he can't die properly. He makes clicking sounds when he's hunting, like he's calling to his prey. I'd always thought those stories were nonsense. Old mountain folklore meant to keep children from wandering too far from camp. But standing there in the gathering darkness, watching a naked figure make inhuman sounds from a rocky ridge, Robert's warnings felt less like folklore and more like prophecy. "Michael?" Andy's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You okay?" I realized I'd been standing frozen for several seconds, the binoculars hanging loose in my hands while my clients waited for some kind of explanation or reassurance. The clicking sounds continued, echoing off the surrounding rocks with a persistence that made my skin crawl. Whatever was up there, it wasn't trying to hide anymore. The clicking continued, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. I stood there with the binoculars in my hands, my grandfather's stories crashing through my mind like a dam breaking. Every rational thought I'd ever had about folklore and superstition crumbled under the weight of what I was seeing on that ridge. "We need to help him," Andy said, already moving toward his pack to grab his first aid kit. Guy could be hypothermic or injured or having some kind of breakdown. "No." The word came out sharper than I intended. "Don't go up there." Andy stopped and looked at me with confusion. "What are you talking about? Someone needs help." "That's not someone." I raised the binoculars again, forcing myself to look closely at the figure despite every instinct screaming at me to look away. The details became clearer with magnification, and what I saw made my stomach turn inside out. "Andy, that thing doesn't have skin." "What?" I handed him the binoculars with shaking hands. "Look at him. Really look." Andy focused on the ridge, and I watched his expression change from concern to confusion to growing horror. The clicking sounds grew more rapid, almost excited, like the thing had sensed our attention. "Jesus Christ," Andy whispered. "What happened to him?" "Nothing happened to him." My voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else. "He's been dead for a long time." The figure began moving then, stepping down from the rocky outcrop with movements that were wrong in every way that mattered. Too fluid, too quick. Joints bending in directions that human anatomy didn't allow. The clicking intensified, echoing off the surrounding ridges like some kind of signal. "Michael, what the hell is that thing?" I couldn't answer. My throat had closed up completely, and all I could hear was Robert's voice from 20 years ago, telling stories I'd dismissed as old mountain legends. The flayed man walks the deep woods, looking for others to join him. Sarah had noticed our attention and was staring toward the ridge with growing alarm. "What's wrong? What's happening?" "Everyone get in your tents," I managed to croak. "Right now." But Andy was already walking toward the edge of camp, his first aid kit in one hand and a flashlight in the other. His natural instinct to help people was overriding every obvious sign that this situation was beyond normal human assistance. "Andy, stop." I lunged after him, grabbing his arm. "You can't help that thing." He shrugged me off with surprising force. "I'm not leaving someone out here to die." "He's already dead." Andy gave me a look that mixed pity with determination. "Michael, that's trauma talking. Someone's in trouble, and we're the only help he's going to get." I watched in growing horror as Andy walked across the meadow toward the approaching figure. The thing that had once been human was maybe 100 yards away now, moving with that unnatural fluidity that made my skin crawl. In the fading light, I could see details that would stay with me forever. The complete absence of skin, the wet gleam of exposed muscle tissue, the way its head turned toward Andy with predatory focus. "Andy, please!" I shouted across the meadow. "Come back!" He raised his hand in acknowledgement, but kept walking. The clicking sounds grew more excited, more rapid, like the thing was pleased with Andy's approach. Jessica emerged from her tent with her camera, probably thinking she could document whatever was happening. Rebecca and Sarah stood near their tents, both looking confused and frightened by the sudden tension in camp. "Everyone pack up," I called to them, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're leaving. Right now." "What? Why?" David's head poked out of his tent. "What's going on?" I couldn't explain it to them. How do you tell people that something from their worst nightmares was walking across an alpine meadow toward your camp? How do you make them understand that the stories their grandparents told weren't folklore, but warnings? Andy had covered half the distance to the figure when it stopped moving. The clicking ceased abruptly, replaced by a silence that felt more ominous than any sound. Even the normal forest noises, insects, small animals, wind through the trees, seemed to stop completely. "Hello?" Andy called out, his voice echoing across the meadow. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The thing turned toward him with a movement so quick and jerky that it looked like a film with missing frames. For several seconds, they faced each other across maybe 50 yards of mountain grass. Andy with his first aid kit and good intentions. The flayed man with its exposed musculature gleaming wetly in the last light of day. Then it rushed him. The speed was impossible, inhuman. 1 second the creature was standing motionless. The next it was covering the distance between them faster than any living thing should move. Andy had time to take 1 step backward before it reached him. What happened next will live in my nightmares until the day I die. The thing grabbed Andy with hands that moved like striking snakes, lifting him off the ground despite Andy being a big man with solid hiking muscle. Andy's scream cut across the meadow, a sound of pain and terror and complete incomprehension. I started running toward them, though every rational part of my mind was screaming at me to run the other way. Andy was my responsibility, my client, and I couldn't just watch him die. But I was too late, and probably too weak to make any difference anyway. The creature tore into Andy with its bare hands, movements too quick to follow clearly in the fading light. Andy's screams echoed off the surrounding peaks, bouncing back from multiple directions until it sounded like the whole mountain range was amplifying his agony. Then the screaming stopped. I stumbled to a halt maybe 30 yards away, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. Andy was on the ground, motionless, while the thing that had killed him stood over his body making those clicking sounds again. But now the clicks seemed different, satisfied, almost pleased. The creature looked up at me with eye sockets that held something that might have been eyes, though they reflected light in a way that human eyes never did. For several seconds we stared at each other across the bloodied grass, predator and prey, evaluating each other. I turned and ran back toward camp, shouting at the top of my lungs, "Everyone run! Get out of your tents and run!" Sarah and Rebecca were already moving, grabbing packs and gear with the efficient panic of people who'd realized the situation had gone completely wrong. Jessica stood frozen near her tent, her camera still in her hands, staring toward where Andy had died. "Jessica, move!" I grabbed her arm and shoved her toward the edge of camp. "Run into the trees and don't look back." David was struggling with his tent zipper, cursing and fumbling with the mechanism. "What's happening? Where's Andy?" I looked back across the meadow and saw the flayed man approaching our camp with that same impossible speed. It would reach us in seconds. "David, leave it," I shouted. "Run! He finally got his tent open and emerged with his pack half loaded, looking around in confusion at the chaos. "What the hell is—" The creature reached our campsite before David could finish his question. It grabbed him as he tried to scramble away from his tent, dragging him into the darkness beyond our camp, with strength that seemed to ignore basic physics. David's shouts cut off abruptly, replaced by sounds I didn't want to identify. Sarah, Jessica, and Rebecca had already disappeared into the forest, following the smart survival instinct to scatter in different directions. I grabbed my emergency beacon from my pack and ran after them, crashing through undergrowth and low branches in blind panic. Behind me, the clicking sounds resumed, but now they seemed to come from multiple directions. The thing was calling to others, or maybe the mountains themselves were answering its summons. I ran through the darkness until my lungs burned and my legs turned to rubber. Branches whipped across my face, drawing blood that I couldn't see but could taste. My boots caught on roots and rocks, sending me stumbling forward in a barely controlled fall that somehow kept me upright and moving. When I finally collapsed behind a massive fallen log, my chest heaving and my vision swimming with exhaustion, I activated the emergency beacon with shaking hands. The small device blinked to life, sending its distress signal to satellites somewhere far above the mountains. Then I heard them. Clicking sounds echoing through the forest around me, coming from at least 3 different directions. They were closer than they should be, considering how far I'd run. Much closer. I pressed myself against the rotting bark of the fallen tree and tried to control my breathing, listening to the inhuman conversation taking place in the darkness around me. The clicks were deliberate, rhythmic, almost like language, like they were coordinating a search. The clicking sounds had grown closer through the night, circling my hiding spot behind the fallen log like hunters testing their prey's defenses. I'd pressed myself against the rotting bark until my spine ached, clutching the emergency beacon and listening to that inhuman conversation echo through the darkness around me. Every few minutes, silence would fall, and I'd think maybe they'd moved on. Then the clicks would resume from a different direction, closer than before. When the helicopter's rotors finally cut through the forest canopy at dawn, I was barely conscious from dehydration and shock. The search and rescue team found me curled behind that log, mumbling incoherently about clicking sounds and flayed skin. 2 paramedics had to carry me to the helicopter because my legs wouldn't support my weight anymore. The official search for Sarah, Jessica, Rebecca, and David lasted 6 days. Teams combed every ridge, valley, and creek bed within a 10-mile radius of our last campsite. Dogs tracked scent trails that led nowhere. Helicopters photographed every possible route the missing hikers might have taken. Local volunteers joined the effort, covering ground that the professionals might have missed. They never found a trace of the others. Not a piece of clothing, not a footprint, not even the scattered remains you'd expect if wild animals had been involved. 4 people had simply vanished from the face of the earth. The investigators who examined our campsite documented everything with clinical precision. Tents shredded and scattered across the meadow, gear strewn in directions that suggested violent struggle, cooking equipment bent and twisted beyond recognition, but no blood evidence, no clear footprints, no forensic traces that could explain what had happened to 4 experienced hikers. The lead investigator, a graying man named Sergeant Davies, interviewed me twice in the hospital. He listened patiently to my account of the flayed man, taking detailed notes while maintaining the neutral expression of someone who'd heard every possible explanation for wilderness disappearances. "Mr. Thompson," he'd said during our second interview, "you've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes the mind creates explanations for events it can't process rationally." The official report concluded that the missing hikers had likely become disoriented in the darkness, scattered in different directions, and succumbed to exposure in the mountains. My account of the creature was classified as trauma-induced hallucinations,
a psychological response to witnessing whatever had actually occurred. Case closed. File archived. 4 people reduced to statistics in a database of unsolved wilderness disappearances. I stopped working as a guide the week I got out of the hospital. Couldn't even look at hiking gear without my hands starting to shake. The outdoor equipment company I'd worked with for 5 years was understanding about my psychological difficulties, offering counseling services and extended medical leave. But I knew I'd never step foot on a mountain trail again.
3 weeks later, I packed everything I owned into my truck and drove to Seattle. Found a studio apartment in Capitol Hill and took the first office job I could get. Data entry for an insurance company. 8 hours a day of staring at computer screens, processing claims for people who'd never see the inside of a hospital or courtroom. Safe, predictable, urban work that kept me far from anything resembling wilderness. The city suited me. Concrete and steel in every direction. Traffic noise drowning out the possibility of clicking sounds. Streetlights ensuring I'd never again experience true darkness. I walked the same route to work every morning. Ate lunch at the same deli every day. Came home to the same 4 walls every evening. Routine became my anchor to sanity. Months passed. I avoided news stories about missing hikers. Changed the channel when nature documentaries came on television. Crossed the street rather than walk past outdoor gear shops. The mountains existed somewhere beyond my carefully constructed urban bubble, and I intended to keep it that way. Then the package arrived. It showed up on a Tuesday evening in October, sitting outside my apartment door when I got home from work. No return address, just my name and current address written in careful block letters on brown paper wrapping. Inside, I found a wooden box about the size of a shoebox, along with an envelope marked with my name in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. My hand shook as I opened the letter. Robert had been dead for 2 years, killed in a car accident while driving back from one of his solo camping trips. This letter was dated just 3 weeks before his death. Michael, if you're reading this, then you've encountered something in the mountains that I should have prepared you for years ago. I'm sorry for that failure. I thought if I never told you the whole truth, maybe you'd be safe from it. Maybe the old knowledge would die with me. I was wrong. Check the box. Look at the photographs carefully. Your grandmother didn't die before you were born, like I always told you. She died when you were 3, but you were too young to remember her properly. Margaret was the most beautiful woman I ever knew, and the kindest person you could imagine. She loved those mountains more than anything except for your father and you. That love is what killed her in the end. Some people who die in the deep woods don't stay dead the way they should. I don't know why it happens to some and not others. I don't understand the rules that govern it. I only know that it does happen, and that those who come back aren't the same as what they were before. The box will explain better than I can with words. Look at everything inside, even the parts that will hurt to see. You need to understand what you're really dealing with. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this knowledge. I'm even more sorry that I couldn't protect her from what she became. Robert. I set the letter aside and opened the wooden box with hands that felt disconnected from my body. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, were perhaps 20 old photographs. The first one I pulled out showed a beautiful young woman standing beside a mountain lake. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and bright eyes that sparkled with obvious joy. Her hiking clothes looked dated, maybe early 1960s, and she was holding up a fish she'd apparently just caught. Someone had written on the back in faded blue ink, Margaret Thompson, 1962. My grandmother. The woman I'd been told died before I was born, whose memory was too painful for Robert to discuss. Looking at her face, I could see traces of my own features, genetic echoes that had somehow survived 2 generations. She was beautiful, exactly the way I'd always imagined she might have been. I set that photograph aside and reached for the next one. Same size, same age, same woman standing in the same spot beside the same mountain lake. But in this picture, Margaret Thompson had no skin. The raw muscle tissue gleamed wetly in the photograph, just as it had gleamed on the creature that killed Andy and David. Her face was a map of exposed sinew and bone, her eyes reflecting light in that unnatural way I'd seen on the ridge above our campsite. She stood in the exact same pose as the first photograph, holding up the same fish, but she was no longer human in any recognizable sense. The image matched perfectly what I'd witnessed in the wilderness. Every horrible detail, every impossible anatomical feature, every nightmare aspect that I'd tried to convince myself was trauma-induced hallucination. My grandmother had been the first flayed man my grandfather ever encountered, decades before I was born. And somehow, she was still out there in those mountains, along with Andy and David and everyone else who died in the deep woods and refused to stay dead. I stared at the photographs until my vision blurred, my carefully constructed urban reality crumbling around me like a house of cards in a hurricane. The clicking sounds I'd heard in the forest hadn't been my imagination. The creature that killed my clients hadn't been a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. It had been my grandmother, welcoming new members to whatever inhuman community existed in the wilderness beyond the reach of search and rescue teams.